Okay, well, welcome back. We're going to continue talking about the integumentary system. We left off talking about kind of the roles that the integumentary system plays through sensation, through protection, through expression, all these other things. But now we're going to dive into kind of the nuts and bolts. What makes up the different layers of the integumentary system? So the first layer that we're going to talk about is the epidermal layer, or the epidermis. And it consists of different types of cells, some that are super important, and some that are important, but they might be found in other regions of the body. Okay, but the keratinocytes are by far um, one of the most important cells for this kind of layer because it's the found in the majority of the epidermal cells. Right? Keratin is a protein-based structure that a lot of cells in the epidermis are actually dead. These cells are not alive, and so they'll be living, and then they'll mature. They'll start producing keratin, and then they die. And inside the cell is strands of keratin, okay, that provide support, defense, and a structure. Okay? And that's really important for that region. Stem cells, we've talked about stem cells before. We're going to talk about stem cells again and again and again. There are stem cells in the epidermis, particularly in the stratum basal. And so that's the last layer, the deepest layer of the epidermis, and that's where the live cells start. Okay, so these are juvenile, undifferentiated cells. These cells are going to replicate. They're going to go through what we call mitosis, and they're going to start dividing and reproducing, and they really give rise to the keratinocytes as they progress and as they move away from that basal layer. Melanocytes, super important also. Okay, these produce melon, and that material is going to shield our DNA from ultraviolet radiation. So one of the things that I want you guys to know about UV radiation, of course, it's important for the production of vitamin D. Okay, so that's really, really important. But when when UV rays strike DNA, when a UV ray makes it through and it hits a cell that has a nucleus and there's DNA in it, and if it's not protected, that DNA can form bonds on the edges of the double helix. Okay, and so it'll form what we call a thymine dimer. So thymine is one of the nitrogenous bases, and it'll form a link between two thymine. And when it does that, it kinks the DNA and it damages the DNA. And then when the DNA replicates, it has the potential to replicate that damage. Okay? And this is really one of the ways at which things like skin cancer can occur, is that replication would replicate a damaged cell, and then that damaged cell replicates more damaged cells, and on and on and on, and then you can get tumor production and things like that. So super, super important. It occurs in the stratum basal, and then it branches out, and really provides that melon provides a shield. It's a reflective material that provides a shield for radiation. So, and we'll talk more about kind of the evolution of that later. Okay. All right, you have tactile cells. So tactile cells are cells that are associated with nerve fibers. Okay, and so they have what we call a tactile disc. okay, and that is associated with the nerve fiber, and the basal layer of the epidermis is where you would find these. Okay, so remember, a lot of these cells are going to be associated with the last layer of the epidermis because the layers above it, majority of the layers above it, are dead. Okay, so you have to, if you need cells that are alive and you need nutrients and you have to be attached to nerve fibers, you have to be associated with some kind of sensory, you need energy. And so that's that last layer of the epidermis, and we'll come back and look at it here. The dendritic cells, okay, these are cells that are associated with immune. Okay, so these are cells that are actually occurring away from the basal layer in the spinosum layer and the granulosum layer. And so that's not quite the layer that's pure dead, but it's right underneath it. And that's for good reason, because if something penetrates the dead layer, the keratinized layer, the heavily keratinized layer, okay, and it penetrates it like a bacteria or you get cut and some bacteria was on the item that cuts you, okay, then you want your dendritic cells, you want your phagocytes to be there to attack the bacteria, or the viruses, or the fungi that may have just penetrated that system to provide against infection. Okay, so let's look at that. So that first layer is called the stratum corneum. We already kind of talked about this is all dead material, all keratinized, lots of keratin in this material, providing that first line of defense. Okay, and then if it's a thick epidermis, okay, you'll have another layer which we call the stratum lucidum. Okay, that kind of grayish purple layer. Okay, and then underneath that you're going to have live material, okay, or in different stages of being alive, basically. So the stratum granosum, okay, and the stratum spinosum are going to be regions where granulosum is going to have granules, keratin producing granules that are going to be producing that keratin. So they're in kind of this stage of about death. Okay, so they're starting to deteriorate and just fill the body of the cell with keratin. And then prior to that, the spinosum, these cells are maturing. Okay, so they're becoming mature. They're starting to produce the granules that are needed for the granulosum. And then that last layer going from the surface deep, okay, these are all stem cells. These are all immature, often undifferentiated cells, so they don't know what they're going to be yet, and that's called the stratum basal layer. Okay? And then once you get through that, you get to the dermis layer. Okay? Okay, so again, the cells of the epidermis, they're arranged in 4 or 5 zones, or what we call strata or stratum. Okay, and again, they're listed from superficial to deep. Okay, and they're listed from deep to superficial. So the stratum basal layer is that deepest layer. Okay, single layer, stem cells, okay, generating melanocytes, generating tactile cells. Again, this is a region where there's a close connection with nutrients and energy, and is a good living zone of the epidermis. Okay, the spinosum, okay, that layer is again still alive, and they're differentiated now. Those cells are called keratinocytes. Okay, and so they're going to produce keratin. And they have some gaps and junctions where they can share material with each other, kind of communicate with each other, that kind of stuff. And often it is associated with those dendritic cells, those white blood cells, that part of the immune system to help with response if there's a foreign body kind of entering. The granulosome, okay, so again, these are living but on their way out kind of thing, and so they are producing keratin granules, and so that's going to be the site of where the material keratin is being produced, and so they're still alive but carrying out less living functions and just mainly making keratin to make the cell more of a barrier to whatever it might be, water, abrasion, bacteria, heat, different things. Lucidium, if it's 5 layers thick, it's there. So this is thick skin. Okay, thin skin, lucidium wouldn't be there. Okay, it's thin. It's kind of a more pale region, and it's packed with keratinocytes, but they're dead. And so these are dead cells. And then the corneum, hey, is again dead, scaly. You're going to have some scuffing off. So some of these cells are leaving constantly, in certain regions more than others, but keratinicized cells. So they have mature keratin inside them, and there's lots of reasons for it. Again, can't reiterate this too much. It's that first line of defense. Okay? Abrasions, cuts, penetration of bacteria, viruses, water loss, UV penetration, all of it. The first line of defense is that stratum corneum. Okay? And we can just go through them again, just so you can see a little bit different picture, so a little bit different of a dye that dyed these cells, but that stratum corneum, multiple layers thick, all of them are dead. Lucidium, also dead cells, a little bit different kind of building. They have a protein in them called iridium. And so it's a little bit different structure. It's just a different kind of line of defense. And then you have the start of the living cells, granulosum, spinosum, and basal, and then down into the dermis. And then you have these kind of projections from the dermis called the derma papilla. And these regions are really important for providing nutrients to that basal layer. So you'll often see blood vessels are associated with derma papilla, and so that indentation is often where blood vessels are coming up and providing the nutrients to these layers. Okay, now let's switch over, and we talked about the epidermis. Now let's talk about that dermis, the layer underneath that basal layer. The dermis is going to feed the nutrients into the epidermis. Okay? So beneath the epidermis is the dermis. Okay? Again, this is the thickness. This is where your skin, if your skin is, rigid enough that it can prevent abrasions that break open the skin and you bleed and whatnot. That's where this is coming from. That's the dermis. The dermis is providing that. Okay? It consists of a lot of fibers. We already talked about fibers before. It consists of collagen and in some regions elastic or elastin fibers or reticular fibers in regions. It just depends on what region of the body we're talking about, but mostly collagen. Okay, and that's that triple helix protein that we talked about before. The region is well supplied with blood vessels. Of course, this is the region that's feeding the epidermis. Okay, this is a region that has the nutrients, has the oxygen, it's taking the carbon dioxide away. Okay, this is really important for the blood vessels, but this is also the region where you have material that has cells that need to produce things like sweat or sebum or hair or nails. All these things are occurring in the dermis because there's a good blood supply in the dermis, and that's where you're going to have lots of energy associated with it. So even though things like sweat glands are going through the epidermis, sebaceous glands are interacting with a hair follicle that's going through the epidermis, all these living portions of those things, okay, are typically found in the dermis layer. Okay? And then, of course, the dermis is going to be attached to things that can help with movement or help. And you can have muscles embedded in the dermis too. So the erector pili muscle, which is what is attached to your hair and causes your hair to become erect, that is found in the dermis. But a lot of the muscles is a layer below the dermis, and even there will be a hypodermis typically between the actual skeleton muscle and the dermis layer. Okay, but definitely get some muscles that occur in the dermis, okay, to alter things like the epidermis and the dermis layer, so you can get movement of that skin. So facial expression, we already kind of talked about that. Okay, there is muscles attached to it, just not in the form of like true skeletal muscles that you would expect, like for example, like your arm or something like that. That muscle, that skeletal muscle that's attached to your arm or your fingers, things like that, they're a layer. It's a layer deeper than that. Okay. Dermal papillae. Hey, we already kind of talked about that. Those are kind of those finger-looking indentations from the dermis going up. That's where a lot of the blood vessels run up, okay, to provide the oxygen and nutrients needed for the epidermis to survive and grow and reproduce and keep producing keratinocytes that keep moving out to the outer edge. Epidermal ridges are the opposite way, so downward waves of the epidermis that goes into the dermis, and we'll look at both of these in a little bit. Okay, so the dermis really consists of two main zones. The first zone is the papillary zone. Okay, and that is a thin layer of areolar tissue. Okay, and it's normally associated with the dermal papillae. Okay, and that allows for things like leukocytes and other defense cells to move close to the basal layer to provide protection for the living cells. It's also rich in small blood vessels, so a lot of nutrients in that region. And then you have a little more dense connective tissue, which we call the reticular layer. Okay, and so this is a thicker layer of the dermis. It's dense, irregular connective tissue. We already talked about this type of tissue. Okay, and this is where things like stretch marks might occur. Right, so if you have stretch marks, or individuals that have stretch marks, what happens in that region is tears in the collagen fibers causes the stretching of the skin. So often we see this during pregnancy or obesity and things like that. The collagen fibers that occur in the reticular layer, they tend to stretch, and then they tear. Okay, and then there's that, you get this little bit of a different shade, okay, because now your melanophores and some of your other cells have been separated, and so you get these different shades, and it kind of shows that stretch or the striae. Okay? Again, dermal damage happens in this region often. This is where blisters will form either through burns or friction of the epidermis and dermis layer. You'll get fluid that seeps into the areas around this irregular connective tissue. Okay, you'll have some spaces in there, and you'll get this fluid that seeps in there and then starts to form a blister between the dermis and the epidermis. So in between those layers, you'll start to get blisters, and when we get things like sunburns that make it through the epidermis layer and into the dermal layer, okay, they'll create kind of a blister or cause fluid to build up in a blister there. And when that happens, you normally associate that with a second degree burn. Okay, so just looking that papillary layer of the dermis, again, they're going up. Okay, so those cells are kind of up into the epidermis layer. Those finger projections are going up into that epidermis layer. The reticular layer is more dense collagen fibers. Okay, wavy looking, and a lot more organized compared to the papillary layer of the dermis. The hypodermis, that's that third layer, but not truly a part of the skin. But again, we talk about it because it's really important. That's going to occur after the dermis. The hypodermis often is full of adipose tissue. Okay, so you're going to have a lot more fat in this region. That fat provides protection, it provides insulation, it provides nutrients. Really, really important in that region. So fat is, of course, a nutrient reserve. It's also a protective layer from forces that might damaged muscle and things like that, so that adipose tissue would provide that kind of protection. So super important for body protection and pads, but really, really, really important for nutrient supply. Okay, because you have all this excess nutrients that occur in fats, and those fats can be hydrolyzed, and the nutrients can then be used to grow new skin. So subcutaneous fat refers to tissue that is composed predominantly of adipose tissue. Again, energy reserve, thermal insulation. It's thicker in women, normally because women are associated with hormones needed for reproduction. And when we talk about reproduction, the woman carries all the energetic expenditure for reproduction. Sperm is super cheap, and so they tend to build a lot more subcutaneous fat or a lot more hypodermis layers to provide that extra energy for when they are providing for offspring.